Hello, everyone, and welcome to California Coastal Resilience Network webinar series. My name is Jen Fields. I am the facilitator for the Coastal Resilience Network, as well as a Climate Ready Fellow for the State Coastal Conservancy. The California Coastal Resilience Network promotes knowledge exchange through webinars on climate-induced impacts on human communities and coastal habitats. We will provide a link to the network if you would like to join or watch past webinars, including today's, on our website. These links can be found on the registration email and in follow-up emails. Today's presentation will be on a culture of resilience, climate change adaptation, and California's tribal nations. California tribal nations have been adapting to cultural and environmental change for millennia. More than 2.5 centuries of colonialism and forced assimilation have taken a toll, but tribal resilience continues to be the pillar that supports tribal climate change adaptation plans. This webinar will highlight some key examples of how California tribes are meeting this challenge. We will be hearing from Dr. Shasta Gaughen. Shasta Gaughen is an environmental director and tribal historic preservation officer for the Pala Band of Mission Indians in Pala, California. She has worked with Pala since January of 2005. Dr. Gaughen received her PhD in anthropology from the University of New Mexico. She is Secretary of the Board of Native American Environmental Protection Coalition, a co-chair of the Tribal Working Group for Climate Science Alliance, and a member of the Institute of Tribal Environmental Professionals Climate Change Advisory Committee. Dr. Gaughen also oversees the Tribal Climate Health Project, a grant-funded education and outreach project that includes a website, resource clearinghouse, webinars, videos, and in-person presentations on climate change and health adaptation in tribal communities. To go into webinar logistics, we will listen and watch her presentation for about 40 minutes and follow up with a Q&A session. During her talk, if you would like to submit questions, please do so by using the Q&A box on the bottom of the screen. I will collect, review, and read the questions, and Shasta will respond. This webinar will be recorded and available for review after the webinar. And with that, I will happily pass the virtual mic to Dr. Shasta Gaughen.
Thank you so much, Jen. And it's really my pleasure to be here with you today. And I'm glad actually that I'm able to be here. I had a brief moment yesterday where I thought I might have to cancel because Pala caught fire. So we've been dealing with that a little bit today, but fortunately the great firefighters from the Pala Fire Department and CAL FIRE have been on scene and suppressing the fire. So there is right now no danger to any life or any structures in the community. But you know, you talk about culture and climate change and resilience, and there's no better example than to see what happens in the community when something like this occurs. And it's a fire that happened on a cool day in June. So it just goes to show you that fire can happen at any time. So with that little background, I want to talk to you today about climate change adaptation in California and in California tribal nations. And I'm going to start with a little bit of an overview of the work that I do here in Pala. And as Jen said, I am the environmental director, also the tribal historic preservation officer. I'm coming to you from Payolm-Cowichum territory, or the Luiseno territory of the Pala Reservation. And I myself am not a tribal member or a tribal citizen. I am the descendant of Europeans. But I have the honor and the privilege of being able to do this work for the Pala community. So we've spent the last, I would say about 5 years, maybe 6 years now, developing the Tribal Climate Health Project. We've gotten a lot of grant funding for that from a variety of agencies, including the US EPA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the National Indian Health Board, and I work with the consulting firm Prosper Sustainably, and together as partners, we have developed the Tribal Climate Health Project. And this project is intended to be a collaborative project for community well-being, and we began by doing Pala's own climate change vulnerability assessment and adaptation plan, and then using that as a basis to share what we had learned in that process with other tribes so that we could, extend the tools for well-being. And that includes the other side, which is capacity building. So our website, thetribalclimatehealth.org, has a resource clearinghouse and a lot of other tools, trainings, companion tools, assessment plan templates, various survey templates, even tribal resolution templates for accepting and adapting climate change plans. So I invite you to take a look at the tribalclimatehealth.org website, and you may be able to find some tools for your own use there. So I want to start by talking about California's tribal nations, and we have two maps here. We have the one on the left, which shows the EPA's Region 9 tribes in California. So lots of tribes, as you can see, all these little names of different tribal communities and tribal governments, a lot in Southern California, a whole lot in Northern California and in Eastern California. And then you look at the map on the right, and that maps out the cultural areas of the tribes. And I do want to make note here, it's important that the California state boundaries aren't the tribal boundaries. Those tribal boundaries exist since prior to European colonization of California and the Western United States. So the tribal boundaries are overlain by these later historical political boundaries of the United States. And another thing I think it's important to point out is that if you look at the EPA map, there are places like San Bernardino County, Los Angeles County, Ventura, Kern County, a lot of the coastal counties below the Bay Area, where you can see that there are no tribal nations represented. And yet, when you look at the map that has the cultural areas for the tribes, all of California is tribal land. It's just that the communities and the cultures that lived in those areas were never given, or I should say not given, they weren't able to hold on to land that had traditionally been theirs and keep those as ancestral territories as a seat for their governments. So just because there are no tribes, federally recognized tribal nations in those areas, it doesn't mean that that's not tribal land. There are tribes throughout California. They just don't have the recognition that some of the other tribes do from the federal government. So I want to do an overview of what climate change means for tribes and for Indigenous peoples. And I want to start out by just pointing out that every tribal community is unique. So the picture we have on the left here, this is from the Yurok Reservation in far northwestern California. On the right, we have the La Posta Reservation, which is close to the California and Mexico border. You can see they are very, very different. We have rivers and forests in the Yurok community, and we have dry scrub and desert lands in the La Posta community. And these are obviously different landscapes, so they require different approaches as far as climate change adaptation is concerned. But it's also important to bear in mind that it's not just the landscapes that are different, it is the tribal cultures, the tribal traditions, and the tribal histories that are unique. So when you're talking about tribes in California, there are 106 federally recognized tribes, dozens of non-federally recognized tribes, and every single one of them has their own culture and history. There's a significant amount of overlap. In San Diego County, for example, we have 18 tribal nations, which is more than any other tribe in the United States, or I should say any other county in the United States. And there are many that are Kumeyaay, there are many that are Luiseno, there's Cahuilla, there's Cupeño, which is part of Paula, is largely Cupeño along with Luiseno. And even though they might share those overall tribal cultural values, they are still unique and individual tribal nations. Now, we have found that there are disproportionately negative health outcomes on reservations throughout the United States just in general. And this is partly due to underfunded public health services, and this is chronic throughout Indian country. But when it comes to climate change, we're finding that those disproportionate health outcomes are becoming even more exacerbated because some of the health impacts of climate change are happening to tribal nations first. And when you already have underfunded services, or you have a lack of access to the resources that you need to maintain community health, when climate change impacts start to come along, things like high heat or severe drought, or the introduction of new pests that carry diseases that were previously unfamiliar. So for example, ticks coming in that are carrying diseases that are not normally found in certain areas, and they're thriving now because of climate change. Those are continuing to make health outcomes worse in tribal communities. That's part of what the Tribal Climate Health Project is about, is to make sure that tribes are including health impacts and health adaptation strategies in their climate adaptation plans, that it's not just about the effects on the environment, but about the effects on both physical and mental and cultural health. Of course, we know that climate change brings water and food insecurity, and sometimes the one causes the other. If you have water insecurity and you are reliant on crops, then that means that perhaps those crops aren't going to thrive or grow at all. In the instance of fisheries, you may have low water flow in rivers, and so that leads to fish kills because of harmful algal blooms, or just because there's not enough water to support healthy fish populations. So again, in California, that goes from top to bottom. Even in a place like Northern California that we think of as having a lot of rain, they are still experiencing drought. There are water wars going on there, where there's struggles over who has access to the water. And so it has an impact on the rivers and the health of the salmon in those rivers. And in Southern California, we have severe drought. So that affects things like oak health, and oak trees and acorns are a very important food source traditionally. Nobody subsists on them as their daily bread, so to speak, anymore, but it's still important to have access to acorns to make, we wish, the traditional acorn mush. That's the Cupeño word for acorn mush. And if you don't have access to those acorns, then you aren't able to make the mush, and that means that there's impacts to culture. And that leads to this slide about the loss of culture, and loss of culture, community, sovereignty, and rights. You might wonder, well, how is climate change going to impact that? Well, you see here, there's a traditional smoked salmon over on the left, and then we have abalone shells on the right, where it's no longer possible for communities that had abalone fisheries to be able to harvest those. And that's a loss of sovereignty and rights, because those are traditional food sources. But when those lands are no longer owned by tribes, they're no longer part of reservation lands or tribal trust lands, then there's a struggle over who has the right to access those coastal shellfish areas. So that's a loss of sovereignty and rights. And as climate change exacerbates the effects along the coast, there have been die-offs of even those places where you're still allowed to do shellfish harvesting for abalone and for other types of ocean foods. So it's not just about a lack of food, it's about the cultural values and the community values and the previous rights that are attached to those spaces. We also see that a loss of ecological health due to climate change can mean a loss of livelihood. So we have fisheries that are lost. We have forest health that's diminished, which means a potential loss of harvesting of timber and other products from the forest. So people end up losing their jobs. And that's true in tribal communities too. There are many tribal communities that rely on not just subsistence fishing, but commercial fishing, not just harvesting for traditional native plants in forests, but managing those forests for timber. And that money helps to support those tribal communities. So if the fishery is not healthy, if the forests aren't healthy, then the jobs that those provide for tribal communities can disappear. And of course, that also leads to not just economic stress, but emotional stress and cultural stress. And then for tribes, very specifically, adaptation means that you have to do a lot of talking with the federal government and federal agencies. You have to be aware of your treaty rights if you have them and how to protect them. Now, most tribes in California don't have treaties. I believe there is one treaty for the Klamath region on the Oregon-California border. But throughout Indian country, there are a lot of communities that have treaties, a lot of nations that have treaties. And so good faith engagement, consultation, and consent are still important, are still things that need to be done with tribes, even when you're dealing with climate change adaptation. And so what I mean when I say that is that, of course, tribes are going to support the work that's required to develop adaptation plans that go beyond just their own communities. So at the state level, at the federal level. But that doesn't mean that those agencies don't still have to consult with the tribes. Something that is a benefit in terms of, say, sustainable energy, putting up windmills for energy generation or solar panels, you still have to consult with the tribes to make sure that there aren't any cultural issues that need to be addressed in developing those wind farms or those putting up those solar panels or doing work on river flows or habitat restoration. It's still vital to consult with the tribes. And of course, we know that with the ongoing fossil fuel settler colonialism that's happening throughout the United States, there's a lot of protests from Indigenous people about pipelines going through tribal lands that have not undergone appropriate tribal consultation. And so under the climate change regime, that is still just as important. And tribes are having to put themselves out there to push for that because they don't always get consulted the way that the law requires. So let's turn now to California. What does climate change mean for California's tribal nations? Well, so I've got the state here and I just put on there wildfire, extreme heat, and drought. Those are the big deals. There are certainly other climate change impacts in California, but those are the big three, and they are relevant throughout the state. So what does that end up meaning for California's tribes? A lot of these things are very similar to what we've already talked about that are impacts throughout the United States. So starting with loss of subsistence species. I mentioned salmon, I mentioned oak trees. Those are subsistence species. They're not the only ones. There are lots of other plants and animals that are important for tribal traditional food sources, and not just for food, but also for medicines and for ceremonies. So things like white sage, and the white sage is not growing in the same places that it used to. So that's an issue. Or things like chia seed, which, believe it or not, I know chia is a really popular kind of superfood now, but Native people in California have been eating the seeds from the chia sage for a very, very long time. And the chia seeds, the chia sage is not growing in the places that it used to. The drying of wetland areas has an effect on important medicinal species, things like willow trees that grow in riparian areas. I don't know who's listening on this. I don't know what your backgrounds are, but if you didn't already know, willow trees in their bark have salicylic acid, which is basically aspirin. So the willow tree is a really, really important medicinal species for pain relief. Now, again, people still take, aspirin or ibuprofen or what have you, but there are still people who use those traditional plants as medicines and as foods. So climate change is impacting those species. Impacts to ceremonies. Now you might think, well, how can you not still have a ceremony? I mean, a high heat day or a wildfire doesn't mean you can't still pray or go to church, but a lot of ceremonies are dependent on places. And if these places are impacted by climate change, let's say there's a certain spring that is central to a ceremony, but because of drought, that spring has gone dry. You can't do that ceremony if you don't have the spring. Or if you have a ceremony that welcomes the first snow of the year, and it generally takes place in November, but the first snow doesn't come until December. That has an impact on ceremony. Or maybe there's no snow at all. And so it's impossible to do that welcoming of winter, that welcoming of snow, if there's no snow because of climate change. There are impacts because of the loss of subsistence species. If it's important in your ceremony to have a certain traditional food, but the acorns you need to make that food aren't available, then that's going to impact your ceremony. So it's all tied in. Damage to cultural sites, it's very similar to what I just discussed. Cultural sites can be gathering sites for important plant and animal species. They can also be archaeological sites. So most people, when they think of cultural sites, they think of them as being actual physical sites, things that you can see on the landscape. But a lot of times cultural sites are intangible. It's sacred, but you wouldn't be able to say, well, where does the sacredness stop? Where is the boundary where this landscape is no longer sacred? Now, how does climate change impact that? If there's a sacred species that can no longer grow, if there, like in my previous example, if there are waters that are important to that site and those waters have dried up or become dangerous to consume, then that's an impact. But there's also an impact to the more tangible archaeological style cultural sites. I have colleagues in Northern California on the coast who have ancient grave sites, ancient cemeteries that are eroding out of the seawalls, out of the sea cliffs because of the impact of higher waves and rising sea levels. So there are actual tangible damages, and then there are spiritual damages as well that are related to climate change. Degraded gathering areas, I covered that in talking about subsistence species, but again, climate change is making it so that certain species are no longer growing where they used to, or in lesser quantity, or they're not producing the plant parts that are important, like the parts that get eaten or used for medicine. Poor air quality is obviously an issue throughout the state of California. We've had a long time reputation for poor air quality since the 70s. We've gotten better over the decades, but what is causing poor air quality now? Obviously wildfire. That's a big deal. And that impacts people's health. If you have asthma or any other sort of respiratory issue with your health, poor air quality impacts that. But it's not just wildfire, it's also high heat days. On high heat days, there's more ozone. And when there's more ozone, that is more of an irritant to people who already have respiratory issues. Is that more of an impact in tribal communities? To some degree, yes, it is, because in a lot of places, people already have, as we mentioned earlier, some health issues, and it's harder to get resources for those. So poor air quality makes a bad situation worse. Poor water quality, again, a lot of these things, they tie in together, they cross one another. So I don't want to be repetitive by saying the same things I've already said, but again, just to point out that water quality is not just an issue of how much water you have, it's whether you can drink the water that you have. So algal blooms can be an issue. Those are usually a coastal ocean issue, but they can also be an issue in freshwater that can impact water quality. And as wells for those communities that rely on groundwater, as the water tables drop, the water can become more concentrated. If there are harmful components to that water, a lot of groundwater has naturally occurring arsenic. Those can be concentrated when the water itself becomes less available. So that's another climate change impact in tribal communities, which very, very commonly, very frequently rely on groundwater. Food insecurity, again, this is a climate change impact for not just tribal communities, but it's more of an impact for under-resourced or underprivileged communities, and that really is a component for many tribes. Just as a brief aside, I know a lot of tribes in California have gaming, and so you might think, well, that's not really economic insecurity if you have a lot of gaming revenue, but the reality for gaming is that there's only a few tribes that have really, really successful casinos. The majority of them are just making enough extra money to deal with some community issues, but it's a myth that tribal gaming has really improved the economic situation for the tribes. Most tribes in the United States do not have tribal gaming, and that's true in California as well. So that relates to food insecurity because you don't necessarily have the level of income that makes it easy to drive into town and buy whatever food you want. So we're still dealing with that. Climate change makes it worse by making it harder to supplement your food with traditional food sources. Water insecurity, it also relates to water quality. So water insecurity in this case is, can you even access water at all, whether it's whatever quality it may happen to be. So drought is going to make that worse and worse in California for a lot of communities, and it's certainly true for tribal communities. We talked about lack of healthcare access, so I will not go back over that, but I do want to pause for a moment on the mental health issues. Now, everybody potentially is affected emotionally by the stress of climate change. But in tribal communities, everything that I've just talked about adds on to and exacerbates the stresses of climate change on mental health. When you feel like your traditional culture, the things that you've been raised with, the values that you have are threatened because the community that you live in is being affected by ecological changes that make it no longer possible to do the things you used to do, to harvest the fish you used to fish, to gather the acorns that you used to gather. That is really, really hard when your identity is tied up with the ability to do those things. So I've been watching with just great grief and sadness the fish kill that's happening right now in the Klamath River. And I have friends and colleagues in Hoopa, in Klamath, in Yurok, in Tolowa, and that fish kill is like, for them, is like watching relatives die. It's devastating, and it leads to just extreme levels of hopelessness and depression. And already, when you have communities that are dealing with a lot of other issues, this just makes it worse. So this is one thing that we're really trying to focus on in the Tribal Climate Health Project, is to help develop strategies for strengthening community resilience, for emotional and cultural strength, for mental health. So, in having talked about that, that also relates to these threats to cultural identity. Again, and I'll use a non-California example, but I have a colleague who works with the Great Lakes tribes, and he's Anishinaabe. And the Anishinaabe people rely on the wild rice in the Great Lakes as one of their main subsistence and traditional foods. And his question, as climate change started to affect the wild rice harvest, was, who am I if I can't harvest the wild rice? How can I say I'm an Anishinaabe if I can't harvest and prepare my traditional food? And that's true for a lot of tribes. Who am I if I cannot harvest the salmon? In the case of some of the tribes in Northwest California, they've had to buy Alaskan salmon to be able to do their traditional salmon cooks, their salmon ceremonies, because they just don't have access to it anymore in their own communities. So now that I've depressed everybody, let's talk about resilience. And I want to give a couple of examples. So here are 6 tribes, and I'm starting with the one that I work for, the Paula Band of Mission Indians, and giving you some examples of some of the things that we have developed to help strengthen community resilience. So, and I'll go over them in a little bit more detail in a moment, but I just want to stop here on this slide for a moment to give you all a chance to take a look. In Paula, we have our wonderful community garden where we're planting not just traditional plants, but also doing vegetables and flowers and just fun things to grow for the community. We've gotten a lot of grant money to do creek restoration, and we're working with a lot of other tribes on oak tree propagation. We hope to open an oak tree nursery so that we can share those oak tree seedlings with other tribes. We have a community alert system that was part of our climate change adaptation plan, and it's a text-based alert system that people can sign up for. And I was really glad to have it yesterday when I saw that fire peeking up over Gregory Mountain, or Chokla, which is a sacred mountain here in Paula. And I could get on that community alert system and let people know there's a fire, here's where you can get more information, here's where you need to go if you evacuate. So that's a form of resilience in the sense that it makes people feel informed. And when people have information, they feel like they have more power. So climate education and psychosocial resilience, I will go over that in a little more detail in the next slide. But again, I want to just point out what some of my colleagues have done. So Santa Ynez Chumash, which is in Santa Barbara County. There are multiple Chumash bands in Santa Barbara. Santa Ynez is the only one that's federally recognized. But Teresa Romero, who's the environmental director there and is Chumash herself, has done a wonderful job at working with all of the Chumash communities on various climate change issues. So like us, they're doing native plant propagation, doing invasive species removal, and really important here, even though I sort of stuck it in the middle, federal agency partnerships. They are working with the Forest Service on some of this invasive species removal. And those partnerships are really, really key because a lot of times tribes, well, first of all, it's all tribal land ancestrally, but tribes will want to do gathering or they want to help with improving the health of the ecosystem on lands that are no longer tribal lands. So that's why it's important to work with the Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, California Natural Resource Agency, so it can be state agencies as well, so that there's a collaborative partnership between the tribes and the agencies. And that kind of management does really amazing things for both sides. And I'm hoping to see more kinds of collaborations like that in California as we go forward. And again, in Santa Ynez, they have this great database of culturally significant species. And that's not useful just for them. It's also useful when there is something like a wildfire. And you can say, look, here's an area where we know that this species that is hard to come by or that's really sacred to us, it's in this area. Please don't bulldoze that when you're doing a fire line. So if you know what those species are and you know where they are, then you can work in collaboration with partners to protect them. So that's part of resilience for Santa Ynez. 29 Palms, which is in the desert in Riverside County, has done a terrific cultural resiliency and climate plan. So with them, in this particular aspect of their plan, it's about cultural sites and adaptation to manage cultural resource protection, which is super, super important. Because as I mentioned, a lot of times these sites are intangible, but they still need to be protected. You still need to maintain whatever it is about that place that gives it its traditional sacred nature. And of course, when there's actual cultural sites in terms of archaeological sites, campsites, village sites, you want to do what you can to maintain those as well so they don't erode away or disappear. Now, the Yurok tribe, and again, I'm going to talk about them in a little bit more detail. So I'm just going to say at this point, they have a tribal carbon storage program, the first tribal program like it in the state of California, and I think it might be the first one in the United States. I will get to them in a little more detail in a moment. The San Manuel Band have increased their fire resiliency with a lot of fire-related programs on prevention, suppression, and landscape assessment. And again, a lot of that has to do with cultural resource protection, because when bulldozers or hand crews even go out on a fire line, there's a lot of cultural resources out there that can be destroyed, certainly by a bulldozer, but even by a hand crew if they don't know what to look out for when they're out there fighting the fire. And then finally, the Kuruk tribe, and I shouldn't say finally, the Kuruk is, they are doing some amazing work on prescribed fire and cultural burning. And I'm going to talk about them in a little more detail as well. So first, just a little bit about our programs here in Paula. So here's some happy kids. We call these our Planet Paula kids, and they come out and they help us in our community garden. These little ones helped us plant a vegetable garden, and the grown-ups did the harder work of planting some oak trees and some willow trees in our community garden. But of course, this is just a thrill to work with kids in general, but also very important for resilience, because why are we doing this if not for the kids? I don't have children myself, but I still care about the people who do. And these little ones, it breaks my heart that the land that they are inheriting is not the land that their parents and grandparents and their ancestors grew up in. So we're doing everything we can to be resilient for them and to make them more resilient as we deal with these changes. I mentioned that we do tribal psychosocial resilience work in Paula. And so for that, we created When Our Hearts Are Happy. I won't say the words in Cupeño because I don't pronounce them correctly, but this is our tribal psychosocial climate resilience framework. And We developed this so that it could be used by other tribes as well. It is a fairly short document, about 20 pages, and it lays out various strategies that can be tailored for use by different communities. Things you can do to enhance community resilience, not just in terms of physical emergencies like fires or what to do when it's really, really hot, but also resilience in terms of your mental, emotional, spiritual, and cultural health. If you can maintain a strong base of resilient emotional and cultural strategies for dealing with some of the bad news when scary things happen, then it helps to provide a base of support for the entire community. And this is available on the Tribal Climate Health Project website. So if you're interested in that, you can find it there. And we also have a variety of webinars and trainings that we do. And so for Paula and for my program, resilience for the community is obviously our first priority. But our goal with the Tribal Climate Health Project is to enhance the resilience of tribes throughout the United States. So we've developed webinar series and various trainings, and all of them have been recorded and are available again through our website at tribalclimatehealth.org or at the Paula Environmental Department website. And all of these will be available on this slideshow, which is available as a handout. So the Yurok tribe, I mentioned that they have this carbon capture program, and it's through a forest. They have an approximately 45,000 acre forest that they manage as a carbon capture forest. They do some timber harvesting in that as well, but they created a program and an agreement with the state of California's cap and trade program to essentially create carbon credits by managing their forest as a carbon sink. It's a one-of-a-kind program in California, certainly one of a kind for a tribe. These are photos of the forest, which I just thought it might be nice to look at some nice running water and some pretty trees. But these are images from the actual Yurok community forest and their carbon capture program. I mean, if this isn't resilience, I don't know what is. They've managed to take something that is important to them culturally, which is all of the traditional things that can be found in this forest, the health of the river that flows through it, but also translated it into a way to be a little bit of economic development for the tribe, because those carbon credits actually provide revenue to the tribe so that they can continue to expand their program, expand their forest, and also put money into other types of climate adaptation resilience work for their entire community. So I am just blown away by what they do at Yurok, and would love to do something like that here in Paula, but we don't really have forests in Southern California, so we might have to think of a different way. And then last but not least, the Kuruk tribe, also in Northern California, just a little bit more east of the coast. They have just an incredible fire and cultural burning program. Now, I know that in the United States and certainly in California for decades and decades, we've had this fire suppression management plan where any bit of fire was just put out. And what did that do? I think we all know by now that it's been bad news, that the forest understory doesn't grow it doesn't burn just in small fires. It ends up turning into this enormous collection of super, super dry fuel that can just burst into flame and create these devastating wildfires. Part of the reason that happened is not just because of suppression from a state management level, but as soon as European settlers arrived in California, they stopped the tribal folks from doing their traditional management of the land. And that traditional management included fire, not just in Northern California, but in all of California. Even in Southern California, tribes would burn the understory of the oak trees because it would help the trees to create a healthier and more robust crop of acorns. And when acorns are your primary food source, you want as many to grow as possible. So California has never been untouched by human hands and human land management, but the tribes knew how to do it in a way that was sustainable. The Kuruk have brought that back, and they have become a model for tribes throughout the United States and even for indigenous communities outside the United States for bringing fire that helps with understory management. It helps with the propagation of important subsistence foods, medicinal plants. It even creates healthier habitat for animal species. So if you haven't heard about the Kuruk's fire management, on the Kuruk website, they have some terrific videos and a lot of explainers. But it's not just the resilience of the habitat. This also creates resilience for the community because it's a source of tremendous community pride that they've been able to work together to reintroduce these cultural burning practices. And it brings everybody together in that pride in their cultural heritage, and it strengthens the emotional and social and spiritual resilience of the tribal folks in Kuruk. So I hope that some of these examples have been hopeful for you, and that you can see that tribal communities are doing the best they can to keep that culture of resilience, keep that strength that they've had from the beginning. And in all these years, the centuries of colonialism, the tribes are still here. They're still doing this work. They're still trying to teach the rest of us what they've known all along, that there is a better way to be in partnership with the earth rather than trying to be in dominion over the earth. So that culture of resilience, it remains really strong for tribal communities everywhere. And with that, I am delighted to take your questions. Here is my contact information. I also listed the Paula Environmental Department website and the tribalclimatehealth.org website. And please feel free to email me. If you call me, I probably won't answer because I won't recognize your number. But if you leave me a voicemail, I can listen to that and hopefully give you a call back. And I am going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen now and kick it over to Jen.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation and really highlighting how everything is so interconnected. I really appreciated hearing all those resilience projects happening within tribal communities. So it was really inspiring. We have one question in the Q&A, so everyone feel free to ask questions here and I'll read them out loud. For coastal tribes, land loss due to beach and cliff retreat, rising sea level tables, and more frequent flooding due to accelerating sea level rise and changing storm patterns will be significant concerns. How can governmental agencies best support and engage the tribal communities across California and beyond on this topic?
Well, that is a great question. Thank you, Patrick. I wish that I had a short and sweet and easy answer for that. If I'm going to be kind of flip about it, I would say, well, just give the coast back to the tribes. Just give it back. It'll be fine. Now, I know that that's not going to happen. So I think really what needs to happen is that you need to reach out to the tribes who have ancestral lands on the coast, but those tribes, for the most part, are no longer living on the coast. One exception is going to be Santa Ynez, but even their reservation is, I forget exactly how far inland, but it's at least 10 or 15 miles inland from the actual ocean and from Santa Barbara. So, I showed that map in the beginning that there's all these ancestral territories up and down the coast. So it would be a good start to find out what are those ancestral lands and who are they associated with. Reach out to those tribes that claim those lands. A little bit easier in Northern California. You have, the Kashaya Pomo on the coast. They actually have coastal lands, going all the way up to the Tolowa and the Yurok. But reach out to all the tribes, because even though not all of them would claim ancestral land on the coast, ancestrally and traditionally, there were trade networks. So even for the Cupeño, whose tribal lands are very far inland, about 50 miles inland from the actual coast, in archaeological sites up there, you find shells from ocean shellfish. And so, there's trade that's going on. Even in the mountains and the deserts in the Eastern Sierra, there's trade with the mountains. So as far as supporting and engaging them on this particular topic, just make sure that you know who the person is that you need to talk to at the tribes. Do some work to reach out and say, who's my contact person? Is it, it's probably not going to be the tribal leader, the tribal chairperson. Those people are usually too busy to be engaging directly with the agencies. But if they have an environmental department, then find those people and just start yourself a little network snowball. When you find one person, you can say, well, now I know who it is in Paula. Who can I reach out to in Rincon? And we can help you with that contact. And I also would recommend, if you can, give presentations at tribal conferences. So, and I say that partly self-servingly because I am organizing the US EPA Region 9 tribal conference this year. It's going to be in October in Lake Tahoe, but it would be terrific to have agencies other than EPA giving presentations, and that's a great place to just start those relationships.
Awesome, thank you. You mentioned willow, sage, oak, and several other species that are important for tribal communities. Do you have any resources you can share for people conducting habitat restoration projects that illuminate some culturally significant native species that can be returned to coastal habitats?
So another good question. I don't know of a specific resource, but in general, if it's a native plant, then it's probably got some sort of a tribal use or some sort of tribal significance. So that would again be a question for somebody like Teresa Romero at Santa Ynez, and I can certainly help you make that connection. But some of the stuff that's along the coast is actual ocean resources, so things like kelp. Kelp were harvested. Anything that can be done to help improve shellfish habitat and fisheries, those are really important. And we're not going to be doing probably any sort of restoration of hunting of any particular ocean species, but fishing, which is, I guess it's a form of hunting, but things that are going to enhance the fisheries as well. And as the oceans are warming, of course, that's going to be more and more of an issue. But as far as things that are on the actual coast itself, I'm thinking of Southern California. We have the Torrey pine, which had a pine nut that could be harvested. So, essentially anything that's a native species is something that should be used in habitat restoration.
Awesome. And there we go. One more. Do you have any know of examples of tribes or state agencies such as California Department of Fish and Wildlife, wild refuges, and state parks of collaborations on land/resource management?
So yes, there's some pretty good collaboration with some of the state parks. So we have a good relationship with California State Parks for the Palomar district, and for why am I suddenly blanking on the name of the desert park? Anza Borrego Desert State Park. So those are relationships more for gathering than anything else. So when we want to go to Palomar, or when tribal members want to go to Palomar and do oak harvesting, black oak is a preferred species. It doesn't grow in, excuse me, doesn't grow in Paula because it needs a high elevation. So when we want to go up there and harvest on Palomar State Park land, we have an ongoing agreement with the park that really all we have to do is call and say, X number of people is going to come and they're going to be in this grove and they're going to be harvesting acorns. Anza Borrego is a little bit more of a formal relationship because they have some areas that are actually closed to the public, but they're cultural preserves. So we can ask for permission to go into those and harvest mesquite beans. And there's a lot of relationships like that with specific state parks. I think the Yurok, I'll mention them again. They have a relationship with one of the state parks up there where the Yurok tribe is actually running the park on their behalf, or like running their campground and their visitor center, which has been really great from a cultural point of view. And I just got off a call before this webinar where I've been working for the last year and a half with Cal OEHA, which is the Office of Environmental Health something something. I can never remember what that acronym stands for. So if any of my OEHA people are listening, I apologize. Please put it in the question box because I can't remember. But OEHA is about health, but they've been working with me and some other tribal environmental directors on developing a list of climate indicators and how those indicators are affecting tribal nations. So that's been a really terrific collaboration to make sure that tribal concerns are included in their assessment of the health impacts of climate change. So there are examples out there. Some relationships are more complicated than others. Last example I'll give that I should have thought of first off is CAL FIRE. So the example I gave of the Kuruk and their controlled burning, that's partly been a federal project as well. They partnered with Six Rivers National Forest on that, but CAL FIRE has been extremely active in that partnership in making sure that they're working together to make those controlled burns safe and done appropriately within the bounds of the law.
And Lori helped you out, Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment.
That's it. I always forget the hazard part. Thank you, Lori. I had a feeling you might be here. So.
Great. Okay. One last question, unless someone else pops in. Another collaboration and partnership question. Have you seen any successful examples of partnerships between tribal nations, federally recognized or otherwise, and local governments in adaptation planning? Or examples of when trust and meaningful relationships have been meaningfully built in collaboration on a climate project?
Yeah, so thank you for asking about the local governments. That is a big deal, and tribes end up dealing more with their local governments than with the state government in general. And of course, we have a lot of federal stuff as well. But here in San Diego County, we have developed a pretty good partnership with our local county government and county agencies. It can be, it can be hit or miss sometimes, and realizing that those agencies have generally, very large populations to deal with. And historically, they have not really interacted that much with the tribes because they see the tribes as sovereign, which they should, but also as federal. And so, actually, here's a great example from this morning. I went over to the fire, the incident command area, and there was a woman there from the California or from the San Diego animal control. And it was because they help with evacuations. And she said, well, we're here, but technically this isn't our jurisdiction because it's federal land, it's tribal land. So really, if you guys have evacuations you need to do, you can't count on the San Diego County Animal Control to be able to help you. We have to get permission. So that's interesting. And it made me think there's a collaboration that I need to develop. We need to have some sort of cooperative agreement between the animal control, because we have tribal members with livestock, horses and cows and, pigs and chickens. And I don't want there to be another fire before we figure out how to make sure that they have the resources they need to help evacuate if necessary. So it's a long process to build those relationships just because of the different the issues of sovereignty for the tribes and the issue of not having jurisdiction on the part of the local governments. All that being said, we have this wonderful group in San Diego called the Climate Science Alliance. And the Climate Science Alliance, Amber Paris is the executive director. We have worked together to develop a tribal working group. And that tribal working group includes representatives from most of the tribal nations in San Diego County, a good handful of them from Riverside County, and even from Morongo. And having that group together, we have been able to reach out as a group to be able to talk to agency representatives. And it's been a lot more effective because I think suddenly the agency folks realize tribes aren't just blank spots on my county map. They're actually people there who are doing this work and that we should collaborate with to make sure that our climate change adaptation planning doesn't stop at the reservation border. that doesn't make any sense because climate change certainly doesn't recognize any borders. So having that group as an advocacy group and a place where an agency person can come and talk to representatives from potentially, 30 tribes at the same time has been really great. So I would recommend that, depending on where you are in the state, to maybe talk to some of your local tribes, see if they have a group like that, a collaborative group. And I will also offer, even though it's not quite on the same page as climate change, but I organize a monthly call of California's tribal historic preservation officers and cultural staff, where once a month we get together and basically, bitch about how terrible agencies are or talk about examples of when they've done good work. And we will have guest speakers sometimes. So that's a good way to get in touch with tribal folks from out California, all at the same time in one place. So if you're interested in that, please reach out to me.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I don't see any other questions in the chat, so it's possible that people get maybe 2 minutes more of their day back. I just want to thank you so much again for all your time and giving that wonderful presentation on a really important topic. Thank you to all the attendees that have attended the session to listen in, and I hope everyone learned something new today. Slides in the recording will be available as soon as possible. So someone put in the chat about the contact info. Are you okay if I share that your contact info in the send out email as well?
Of course, of course.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their week.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.